Okay, so I don't even know where to start with this. I've been sitting here for the past hour just staring at my screen, trying to figure out how to put all of this into words. I've read through this forum probably 100 times over the last few months, just lurking, reading other people's stories. Thinking, man, at least I'm not alone in this. But I never thought I'd be the one posting. I never thought my life would turn into the kind of story that makes people stop scrolling. But here we are. My name is Margaret. I'm 68 years old. And about 3 weeks ago, I walked out of a room where my entire life got erased in front of a group of people who were smiling while it happened. Let me back up, because if I just jump to the part with the key and the bank and Nathan, none of it's going to make sense. And honestly, the context is what makes this whole thing hit the way it does. So, bear with me. I drove to that attorney's office the morning of the reading wearing the gray wool dress Robert had always said made my eyes look softer. I don't know why I did that. Maybe I was trying to hold on to something familiar. The drive took 42 minutes, and I remember every single one of them because I spent the whole time talking to him in my head, the way you do when someone's gone and you keep having conversations with a person who can't answer back anymore. It's okay, Robert, I'll be okay. I know you took care of everything. That was what I kept repeating, almost like a prayer, almost like if I said it enough times, the universe would have no choice but to make it true. The waiting room at Harmon & Sloan smelled like old paper, and that particular kind of corporate air conditioning that makes you feel slightly invisible the moment you step inside. Stephen was already there when I arrived, sitting with his legs spread wide like he owned the chair, the floor, and probably the building too. He had his father's jawline, but none of his father's grace. He was the kind of man who filled up a room with noise and called it presence. He glanced up when I walked in, gave me a look that lasted maybe half a second, and went back to his phone. Catherine was standing near the window. She was wearing a blazer that probably cost more than my first car, her hair pulled back so tight it looked like it was fighting her face. She didn't even acknowledge me. Not a nod, not a blink, nothing. We had spent 40 years in the same orbit, shared hundreds of dinners, sat in pews together at Easter and Christmas, and she looked through me like I was a smudge on the glass behind her. Michael was the only one who met my eyes. He always was the most complicated of the three. There was something behind his expression that day I couldn't quite read. Not warmth exactly, but something unsettled, like a man who already knew the ending of a movie and wasn't entirely sure he liked it. I sat down in a chair near the door, not because I was thinking about making a quick exit, but because every other seat was near one of them and I just couldn't. The attorney, a man named Gerald Holt, had the energy of someone who had delivered bad news so many times that he'd learned to make his face completely unreadable. Silver hair, rimless glasses, a tie the color of a bruise. He shook my hand and held it for maybe 1 second too long, and I remember thinking, oh, the way you sometimes just know something before you have the information to back it up. He waited until everyone was seated, opened a leather folder, cleared his throat, and started reading. I'm not going to walk you through every line. I can't. Even now, 3 weeks later, some of it still sits in my chest like a stone that won't move. What I will tell you is that within the first 4 minutes I understood that Robert had structured that will in a way that left me with almost nothing that could be seen, touched, or deposited into a checking account. The Brookline mansion, which I had painted, furnished, cleaned, hosted in, grieved in, and made a home out of for 4 decades, went to the 3 of them jointly. The primary investment accounts, the business holdings, the retirement funds, all distributed between Stephen, Catherine, and Michael in varying percentages that the 3 of them had apparently already discussed. Because not one of them looked surprised. Not one single muscle moved on any of their faces. I sat there, and I listened, and I kept my hands perfectly still in my lap, because I absolutely knew, that if I moved them, they would shake, and I was not going to give those people the satisfaction of watching me shake. When Gerald finally got to my portion, there was this half-beat pause, the kind that only lasts a second but somehow stretches into something much longer. He reached into the folder and pulled out a small envelope, the kind you'd buy at a drugstore, brown and plain, the flap sealed with a piece of tape that had slightly yellowed. Inside was a key. Not a modern key, not the kind you'd use to open a safe deposit box at a bank downtown. This was old, heavy in a way that surprised me when I held it. The bow, that's the part you hold, was cast iron, shaped in a pattern that looked almost like two-letter R's back to back. The blade was long and slightly irregular, like something made by hand rather than machine. The whole thing was maybe 4 inches long, and it sat in my palm like it had weight beyond its size. Underneath the key was a folded card with an address written in handwriting I recognized immediately. Robert's handwriting. Not the practice signature he used at the firm, but the real one, the one he used when he was writing something that mattered to him. The letters pressed slightly harder into the paper, the way his always did when he was thinking carefully. The address was in a town called Harlan Creek, Vermont, a town I had never heard of, and that was it. That was my inheritance. I could feel Stephen shift in his chair. I didn't look at him, but I heard that specific sound of leather creaking when a person is trying to contain a laugh. Catherine made a small sound low in her throat, something that wasn't quite polite enough to be called a cough. Gerald kept his eyes on his folder. I stood up. I picked up the envelope, put the key back inside it, tucked it into my purse, and I walked out. No dramatic exit. No last words. No slamming of doors. I just walked out because I genuinely did not have the energy to perform anything for anyone in that room, and because somewhere beneath all the shock and the humiliation and the hollow, nauseating feeling in my stomach, there was something else. Something small and stubborn and quiet that kept whispering, "Look at the handwriting, Margaret." He pressed hard. He always pressed hard when it mattered. I drove back to the house, the former house, I had to keep reminding myself, and I packed one suitcase. Just one. I was very deliberate about it. I didn't take the jewelry Robert had given me over the years, even though technically it was mine. I didn't take the photo albums. I took my clothes, my reading glasses, my mother's Bible, the small watercolor painting of a lake in Maine that I'd bought at a yard sale in 1991 for $12, and had always loved more than anything expensive in that house. And I took the framed wedding photo from the hallway. Not because I was clinging to something, but because nobody else wanted it. And because in that photo, Robert was looking at me with the kind of expression that a man can't fake. Whatever else had happened, whatever distance had grown between us over the years, that look was real, and I wasn't going to leave it behind for Stephen to throw in the trash. I loaded the car while the house was still empty. I had maybe 2 hours before they'd come back, already measuring rooms and calculating resale value, I imagined. I took one last walk through the place. Kitchen with the bay window I'd spent years fighting the morning light in. The garden I'd planted in 1998 after we lost the baby. The one they never knew about. The one only Robert and I carried. The hallway where I'd hung other people's children's school pictures for 4 decades and been thanked for it exactly twice. I stood in the doorway of Robert's study, the room that had always been off-limits to me. The door was unlocked now. It had been unlocked since the hospice nurses came. I'd never gone in, even then. But standing there that afternoon with my suitcase by the front door and the key in my purse and nothing left to lose, I pushed it open. It smelled like him. That specific combination of cedar, old paper, and the particular brand of coffee he'd ordered from a place in Portland. I stood in the middle of the room and just breathed for a second, because that smell was the closest thing to him I was ever going to get again. There was nothing remarkable in there. Bookshelves, a desk, a small framed photo of the two of us from a trip to the Outer Banks in 2003 that I'd forgotten he'd kept. But on the desk, propped up against the lamp like it had been placed there intentionally, was a plain white envelope with my name on it. Just Margaret, no last name, just the way he said it when we were alone. I opened it right there, standing in the middle of his study, still in my gray wool dress. You trusted me when you had no reason to. You stayed when leaving would have been easier. I spent 40 years building something for the moment when the people who only wanted what they could take would finally show their hands. That key is the beginning, not the end. Go to Harlan Creek. Ask for Nathan. He'll explain everything. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you sooner. I needed it to be real before I let you see it. I read it 3 times. Then I folded it carefully, put it in my purse next to the key, picked up my suitcase, and drove out of Brookline for the last time. The whole drive to Vermont, my hands were steady on the wheel. Harlan Creek is the kind of town that doesn't show up easily on maps, not because it's hidden, but because it's the sort of place that never needed to advertise itself. Two main roads crossing each other at a four-way stop with a blinking yellow light. A diner with a hand-painted sign. A post office the size of a large closet. A hardware store that looked like it hadn't changed its window display since 1987. I arrived just after 6 in the evening, when the light was doing that particular late autumn thing where everything turns the color of old honey. I pulled into the gravel lot next to the diner because it was the only building that still had its lights on, and I sat in the car for a long moment, just taking it in. I had no idea what I was walking into. I had driven 4.5 hours on adrenaline, grief, and whatever that stubborn thing was that had been whispering to me since I read Robert's handwriting on that card. I was tired in a way that goes below the muscles. The kind of tired that comes from holding yourself together in public for so long that the moment you're finally alone, your body doesn't quite know what to do with itself. I pushed open the door of the diner. A bell chimed somewhere above me. The place was warm and it smelled like coffee and bacon grease and something baking. Cinnamon. Maybe. And there were exactly 3 people inside. An older man at the counter reading a newspaper, a teenage girl behind the register staring at her phone, and a man sitting in the far booth facing the door. He looked up when I walked in. He was younger than I expected, mid-40s maybe. Dark hair with some gray starting at the temples. The kind that happens naturally and not ungracefully. He had the kind of face that looked like it had weathered something, not in a defeated way, but in the way that wood weathers, harder and more interesting with time. He was wearing a flannel shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows. A cup of coffee going cold in front of him. A folder of papers spread across the table. He didn't smile when he saw me. He just nodded, a quiet, certain nod, like a person who had been expecting someone and was relieved to see they'd actually shown up. "Margaret Collins?" he said. "Yes," I said. "I'm Nathan," he said. "Nathan Calloway. Please sit down." He had the kind of voice that was built for delivering serious information, not cold but deliberate, measured, like every word had been considered before it was released. I sat down across from him. The teenage girl appeared and I ordered coffee without looking at the menu. Nathan waited until she walked away before he said anything else. "I've been waiting for you for about 6 months," he said, "since Robert told me you'd eventually come. He wasn't sure exactly when." I wrapped both hands around the coffee mug when it arrived and looked at him directly. "Tell me everything," I said. And he did. What Nathan told me that night in that small-town diner changed the shape of my understanding of the past 40 years. Not all at once. It came in pieces, the way revelations usually do, each one landing and settling before the next one arrived. And by the time he was done talking, somewhere around 9:30, when the older man at the counter had long since folded his newspaper and gone home, I was looking at my entire life through a completely different window. Robert, it turned out, had been doing something quietly remarkable for decades. Starting in the early 90s, he had begun purchasing shares in a small technology company called Viridian Systems. Not flashy, not high profile, but consistent and profitable in a way that compound interest rewards over 30 years. He'd bought those shares using a private investment account that existed entirely separately from the finances that Stephen had spent years trying to influence and eventually, partially redirect. Nathan had been the acting CEO of Viridian Systems for the past 11 years. He'd been brought in by the founding board after the original founders retired, and it was through that process that he'd first encountered Robert Morrison's name as a long-standing silent shareholder. They had met in person only 3 times. But by Nathan's account, those 3 conversations were some of the most substantive he'd ever had. "He talked about you every single time," Nathan said, turning his coffee mug slowly in his hands. "Not in a sentimental way, in the way a person talks about something they've built that they're proud of." He said, "My wife doesn't know this exists yet, and when she finds out, I want her to understand that it was always hers. Every decision I made about this investment I made with her future in mind." I had to look at the window for a second, at the dark glass in the gravel lot and my car sitting under the one working streetlight. "How much?" I said, because I needed to know and there was no gentle way to ask it. Nathan told me. I'll be honest with you, I'm not going to put the exact number in this post because I'm still in the middle of the legal process and my attorney has advised against it. But I will tell you that when Nathan said it, something in my chest did something I don't have a good word for. Not joy exactly, more like the floor coming back up after a very long fall. It was generational. It was more than generational. It was the kind of number that changes not just your life but the architecture of the future around you. The shares are in your name, Nathan said. They've been in your name since 2019. Robert transferred them quietly, well before he got sick. It's clean, it's legal, it's airtight. And Stephen? I said. Does he know? Nathan looked at me with an expression that was almost careful. Not yet, he said. But he will. I held my coffee mug and let that sit in the air between us. Outside, the last light in the hardware store across the street clicked off. The town went a little quieter. And sitting in that booth, in that small diner, in a town I'd never heard of 12 hours earlier, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Not happiness, not relief. Something steadier than both of those things. I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Okay, so where I left off. I was sitting in that booth in Harlan Creek, Vermont, holding a coffee mug that had gone cold without me noticing, staring at Nathan Calloway across a table covered in folders that were about to rewrite everything I thought I knew about my own life. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. Nathan had made a call ahead of time and arranged for me to stay at a small bed and breakfast 2 streets over from the diner, a white clapboard house run by a woman named Doris, who had the kind of warm, no-nonsense energy that makes you feel immediately safe without her having to say a single word about it. She handed me a key, pointed me toward a room at the top of the stairs and said, "Breakfast is at 7:30. I make real eggs, not the powdered kind." That was the extent of her welcome speech, and honestly, it was exactly what I needed. The room was small and clean and smelled like cedar and lavender. There was a quilt on the bed that looked handmade, deep blues and faded golds in a pattern I didn't recognize but found myself tracing with my fingers for a long time after I sat down on the edge of the mattress. The window faced a backyard where an old apple tree had dropped most of its leaves and was standing bare and patient against the night sky. I sat there in that quiet room in that town I'd never heard of, with everything I thought I owned reduced to one suitcase and a wedding photo leaning against the wall, and I tried to organize my thoughts. I couldn't. Not because I was falling apart. Surprisingly, I wasn't. I think the shock had done something useful. The way extreme cold sometimes numbs a wound before you can really feel it. What I kept coming back to over and over was a single image. Robert at his desk, in that forbidden study, pressing a pen hard into a note card, writing my name the way he said it when we were alone, leaving a trail of breadcrumbs through 40 years of silence. He had known. He had always known what his children were. He had watched them maneuver around him his entire life, and he had made a decision. Not the coward's decision. Not the decision of a man who looked the other way because confrontation was uncomfortable. But the decision of someone who understood that the best revenge isn't loud. It's patient, it's quiet, it's a key in a brown envelope handed to a woman they thought they'd already buried. I don't know exactly when I fell asleep. At some point the apple tree outside went from something I was consciously looking at to something I was dreaming about. And then it was 6:45 in the morning and the smell of coffee and actual eggs was coming up through the floorboards, and I was still in my gray wool dress. Doris had a dining room table that sat 8, but that morning it was just me and a retired schoolteacher from Connecticut named Harold, who was passing through on his way to see his daughter, and who talked about fly fishing for exactly 22 minutes without pausing for breath. Under any other circumstances, I might have found that exhausting. That morning I found it oddly grounding. Harold had no idea who I was, no idea what had happened to me the day before. No idea that the woman across the table from him was sitting on the edge of the most significant discovery of her life. He just talked about flies and river currents and the specific weight of a good rod. And I ate my eggs and nodded and let his ordinary comfortable words fill up the silence. By 8:15 I was back in Nathan's diner booth. He was already there. Different shirt, same quality of attention. The kind of person who shows up fully, no half measures. He had a fresh folder in front of him and a legal pad with handwritten notes down the left margin. and he stood up briefly when I came in, which I noticed. It was a small thing, but it was the kind of small thing that tells you a lot about a person. "How'd you sleep?" he asked. "Badly," I said, "but productively." He almost smiled at that. That tracks. We ordered coffee, and he waited for it to arrive before he opened the folder. That second morning in Harlan Creek was when I started to understand the full scope of what Robert had built, and I want to try to describe what that felt like, because I don't think I've fully processed it even now. You know how sometimes you've been living in a house for years and you think you know every room, every corner, every squeaky floorboard, and then one day someone opens a door you always assumed was a closet, and behind it is an entire wing of the house you never knew existed? It felt like that, except the house was my marriage, and the wing was enormous. Viridian Systems, Nathan explained, had started as a data management firm in the late 80s, the kind of company that doesn't make headlines but keeps other companies running. They handled record systems, compliance infrastructure, archival processing. Unglamorous work, deeply necessary work. Robert had first heard about them through a client case in 1991 and had quietly purchased a small position in the company almost as an afterthought. But Robert had a gift, and this was something Nathan said with a kind of straightforward admiration that clearly wasn't performance. Robert had the gift of understanding what things were worth before other people caught on. He saw that Viridian was sitting on a methodology for data organization that would become more valuable, not less, as the digital landscape expanded. And so every year, quietly, without fanfare, without telling a single person in his family, he bought more shares. He never sold, Nathan said, tapping the legal pad. Not once. In 30 years, he never sold a single share. Even when the market did things in 2008 that made grown men cry, he held. He called me once, actually. This was before I was CEO. I was still on the board. And he said, "Nathan, I'm not building a portfolio. I'm building a foundation. Those are different things and they require different decisions." I recognized that sentence. Not the exact words, but the rhythm of them, the philosophy behind them. That was Robert. That was how he talked when he believed something completely. The shares appreciated at a rate that... Nathan paused and chose his words carefully. "Margaret, Viridian went through an acquisition process in 2021. A larger firm bought a 40% stake, and the valuation at that point established a per-share price that..." He slid a single sheet of paper across the table. I looked at the number. I put the paper down. I picked up my coffee. I put it down. "That's the current value," Nathan said, "of the shares that are in your name. Transferred legally, documented with a paper trail that goes back to 2019 when Robert made the formal designation. Your name has been on this for 5 years, Margaret. This was never his to give away, it was already yours." I want to tell you that I had some profound response to that moment. I want to tell you I cried or laughed or said something worth repeating. But the honest truth is that I sat there in that diner booth in Harlan Creek, Vermont, on a Tuesday morning in November, and I thought about the garden I'd planted in 1998 after we lost the baby. I thought about how I'd gone out there the following spring and every spring after that and tended it. Not because anyone asked me to, not because anyone noticed, but because I needed somewhere to put the love that didn't have anywhere else to go. Robert had been doing the same thing, just in a different kind of garden. "There's more," Nathan said, quietly. "And this is where it gets complicated." The complication had a name. Stephen. Nathan opened a second section of the folder, and I could tell from the way he organized his breath before speaking, that small, controlled inhale, that this part was going to require more from me. Stephen Morrison, it turned out, had known about the Viridian investment. Not the full scope of it, not the numbers, not the legal transfer, not any of the details that actually mattered. But he had known that his father had some kind of separate financial interest in a company in Vermont. He'd found a reference to it years ago while going through Robert's desk during one of his visits, a bank statement from an account he didn't recognize with a Vermont routing number. And rather than ask his father about it directly, Stephen had done what Stephen always did. He'd started maneuvering. Over the course of the last 3 years of Robert's life, Stephen had been building a quiet, methodical case, To have his father declared incompetent to manage his own financial affairs. Nothing overt, nothing that would trigger alarms. Small things. Conversations with Robert's physician where he expressed concern about his father's memory. A consultation with a second attorney about the process of obtaining financial guardianship. A series of emails to Catherine where he laid out a timeline. Nathan had copies of some of those emails because Robert's personal attorney, a different man from Gerald Holt, one who actually had Robert's genuine interests at heart, had been monitoring the situation. Your husband knew what Stephen was doing, Nathan said. He knew probably a year before he died. And he didn't confront him. Because confronting him would have tipped his hand, I said. Nathan looked at me. Exactly. That was the thing about Robert that nobody in his family had ever fully understood. They thought his reserve was weakness. They thought the distance he kept from conflict meant he wasn't paying attention. They had spent decades misreading patience for passivity, and that misreading was about to cost them everything. Stephen had spent 3 years building a case to take control of an asset that had already, legally and cleanly, been in my name since 2019. The incompetency petition, which he had been carefully preparing to file after the will reading, once he had the other assets secured and felt confident enough to make his move on the Vermont account, was going to crash directly into the brick wall of a legal transfer that predated his entire scheme by years. He doesn't know yet, Nathan said again, same careful tone as the night before. But when he finds out, I started. When he finds out, Nathan said, he's going to have a very significant problem. Because in the process of building his case for incompetency, Stephen made some claims, documented claims, in writing, to multiple parties, about his father's mental state during the exact period when Robert made the share transfer. If those claims are used the way his attorney will inevitably try to use them, they'll directly contradict the legal validity of a transfer that Stephen himself will then desperately need to be valid. I stared at him. He built a trap, I said slowly. He built a trap and he walked into it himself. Robert didn't design it that way intentionally, Nathan said, though something in his expression suggested he wasn't entirely sure about that. But yes, that's effectively what happened. I thought about Robert in his study, pressing his pen hard into paper, leaving a note for a woman he knew was going to need it. I thought about 40 years of watching and waiting and saying nothing, and building something in silence while the people around him assumed they already knew the ending. What do I need to do? I said. Nathan folded his hands on the table. First, he said, you need an attorney. A good one. Not Gerald Holt. Obviously not Gerald Holt. I have a name, he said. She's based in Burlington. Her name is Patricia Wren, and she is... He paused, searching for the right word. She's the kind of attorney that opposing counsel has nightmares about. She called me last week, actually. Robert had already been in contact with her. He put her on retainer 6 months before he died. Of course he had. Of course he had already done that too. I let out a breath that I think I'd been holding since the previous morning in that attorney's office in Brookline. There's one more thing, Nathan said. He reached into the folder and pulled out a smaller envelope. Not brown this time, white, sealed. My name on the front in that same pressed handwriting. He left this with me. He said to give it to you after I'd explained everything, after you understood the full picture. I held it for a moment without opening it. The teenage girl from the night before, different outfit, same phone, came by and refilled our coffee without being asked. Outside, a woman was walking a large orange dog past the diner window, and the dog stopped and pressed his nose against the glass and fogged it up, and the woman tugged gently at the leash and they moved on. I opened the envelope. The letter inside was longer this time. 2 pages front and back, the handwriting slightly more labored than the note I'd found on his desk. This was written when he was already sick, I could tell. The pressure of the pen less even, the letter slightly larger, but the voice was unmistakably his. I'm not going to share everything he wrote. Some of it belongs only to me. But there were 2 things in that letter that I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. The first was an apology. Not for the distance, not for the separate accounts, not even for the secrecy, but for the specific conversation we'd had in 2009. When I'd asked him, quietly and carefully, whether he thought his children would ever truly accept me. And he had said, "Probably not, but it doesn't matter." And I had smiled and said, "You're right, it doesn't matter." And we had both pretended that was the end of it. He wrote, "It mattered." I knew it mattered, and I said it didn't because I didn't know how to fix it. That was a failure I've thought about more times than I can count. I should have chosen you out loud. I chose you in every way I knew how, but I should have done it where you could see. I had to put the letter down for a minute after that one. The second thing was a sentence near the end, after he'd explained some of the financial details in his own words, after he'd written about Viridian and Nathan and Patricia Wren. It was almost offhand, tucked between a practical instruction and a closing paragraph, the way he always hid the most important things in the middle of other things. "The house in Harlan Creek is yours too, by the way. It's been in your name since 2017. I've been having it maintained. Doris checks on it every few weeks. I think you'll like it." I looked up at Nathan. "The bed and breakfast," I said. "Doris." Nathan nodded slowly. "She knows," I said. "She's known for 2 years," he said. "Robert asked her to look after the property, and she's been doing it quietly. She didn't know all the details, but she knew you'd be coming eventually." I thought about Doris handing me that key the night before. "Breakfast is at 7:30. I make real eggs, not the powdered kind." The woman had known exactly who I was, and she'd given me a room and fed me breakfast and let me find my own way to the information. And I thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that the kindest people in the world are the ones who understand the difference between help and rescue. "Can I see the house?" I asked. "Whenever you're ready," Nathan said. I picked up my coffee. It was finally the right temperature. "I'm ready now," I said. The house was 3 blocks from the diner on a street called Millbrook Lane that dead-ended at a small creek, the one presumably that gave the town its name. It was a craftsman-style house, not large, painted a deep sage green with cream trim, with a covered front porch that wrapped around the side and a yard that had been kept up but not fussed over. 2 oak trees flanked the front walk, enormous and old, the kind of trees that make a house feel like it has always been there and always will be. Nathan stood back while I used the key. The iron key. The one from the brown envelope. The one that Catherine had barely bothered to look at before going back to calculating the square footage of the mansion. It turned smoothly. The door swung open without a sound. Inside smelled like cedar and clean air, and very faintly, beneath everything else, like the specific brand of coffee Robert had ordered from Portland. I stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then I stepped inside. I need to take a second before I get into this part. Because what happened over the next few days is the kind of thing that, when you try to explain it to someone, sounds either too convenient or too painful. And the truth is, it was somehow both at the same time. I want to be honest with you all the way through this, the same way I've been honest from the beginning. This isn't a story where everything suddenly became easy. The house in Harlan Creek was beautiful, and it was mine, and I stood in the doorway of it on a Tuesday morning in November, feeling something I hadn't felt in 40 years. The specific, almost physical sensation of standing in a space that belonged entirely to you. And then I went inside and sat down on the floor of the empty living room and cried for about 45 minutes straight. Not sad crying. Not happy crying either. Something in between that doesn't really have a clean name. The kind of crying that happens when your body finally decides it's safe enough to let go of something it's been holding for a very long time. Nathan had the good sense to wait on the porch. When I finally came out, eyes swollen, gray wool dress slightly worse for wear, he handed me a bottle of water from his jacket pocket without saying a word, and we stood there on that wraparound porch looking out at the 2 oak trees and the dead-end street and the thin silver line of the creek, visible through the bare branches at the end of the road. "It's a good house," he said eventually. "It's a very good house," I said. And that was that. Over the next 3 days, Nathan walked me through the full picture of what Robert had built. We sat at a folding table in the empty kitchen of the Harlan Creek house with coffee and printed documents spread between us. And piece by piece, the architecture of 40 years of quiet intention became clear to me in a way that still, even now, makes me stop sometimes in the middle of an ordinary moment and just breathe. I want to describe Nathan to you properly, because I think I undersold him in my last entry and he deserves better than that. He was 46 years old, though he had one of those faces that could pass for either younger or older depending on the light and his level of exhaustion. He was tall, not in a way that announced itself, but in the way you notice when he stands in a doorway. That particular adjustment a tall person makes to fit themselves into spaces built for average. He had hands that looked like they'd done actual physical work at some point in his life, not just paperwork, with a small scar along the outside of his right palm that I didn't ask about for a long time. His hair was dark with gray, threading through it at the temples in a way that was honest rather than managed. He wore flannel and wore it well, which I realize sounds like a small thing but somehow told me something accurate about his character. He dressed for the actual life he was living rather than the one he wanted people to think he was living. He was direct without being blunt. He had the rare quality of being able to deliver difficult information without making you feel like a burden for needing to receive it. When I asked questions, he answered them completely, not partially. And when he didn't know something, he said so without any apparent discomfort about admitting it. He'd been widowed 4 years earlier. His wife's name was Claire. He mentioned her once in those early days, briefly and without performance. The way people mention someone who is gone but not absent, present in the past tense, woven into who you are without needing to be constantly explained. He had a daughter named Sadie, 17, who lived with him in Burlington during the school week and came to Harlan Creek on weekends because she loved the town. The way teenagers sometimes inexplicably love small, quiet places that their peers would find boring. I didn't think much about any of that in those first few days. I was too deep in documents and revelations and the slow, careful process of understanding what my life had actually been and what it was now becoming. But I noticed. The way you notice things you're not ready to examine yet. Peripheral. Soft focus filed away for later. The financial picture when fully assembled was this. Robert had accumulated shares in Viridian Systems over 30 years that, at current valuation, represented a holding significant enough that when Nathan said the number out loud on that second morning in the diner, I had thought for a moment he'd made an error. He hadn't. Patricia Wren, who I met via a video call on the third day, a compact woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and reading glasses she kept taking on and off, and the specific energy of someone who has won enough fights to stop being nervous about the ones still ahead, confirmed every figure independently. Beyond the shares there was the house itself, which Robert had purchased in 2014 and had been quietly maintained and partially renovated over the subsequent years. It was fully paid for. The property taxes were current. The small amount of ongoing maintenance had been handled through a local account that Robert had funded separately. There was also a life insurance policy, not the primary one that had been distributed as part of the estate, but a secondary policy taken out in 1998. The year of the garden, the year I mentioned in my last post, the year neither of us had ever spoken of to anyone. The beneficiary on that policy had always been me and only me, and it had never been part of the estate because it had never needed to be. It transferred directly. I sat across from Patricia Wren on a laptop screen in the kitchen of my new house, in a town I'd never heard of a week earlier, and listened to her lay out the full landscape of what I owned. When she finished, she took her reading glasses off and looked at me directly through the screen. "Margaret," she said, "I want to be very clear about something. What your husband put together here was not impulsive and it was not accidental. This took years of careful, deliberate legal work. He was extremely thorough, and he was extremely angry, on your behalf, in a way that never showed on the surface but is evident in every single document he signed. I thought about Robert. About his stillness, about the way he could sit in a room full of noise and conflict and simply wait. He never showed anger, I said. No, Patricia said. He converted it. That's different, and considerably more effective. On the fourth day, Stephen called. I had been expecting it. Not that specific morning. Not that specific hour, 9:17. While I was standing in the backyard of the Harlan Creek house watching a pair of cardinals argue over the bird feeder that Doris had apparently been maintaining along with everything else. But I had known it was coming. Nathan had warned me that Gerald Holt was legally obligated to notify all parties once the asset transfer documentation had been filed with the court, which Patricia had initiated on day 2. That filing was essentially the opening bell. My phone buzzed against the kitchen counter, and I walked inside and looked at the screen, and there was Stephen's name, and I stood there for 3 full seconds, just breathing, before I answered. Margaret. His voice was doing the thing it always did when he was containing something. Too even. Too controlled, like a man walking very carefully on ice he knows is thin. I think we need to talk. Hello, Stephen, I said. I've been speaking with Gerald, and apparently there's been some confusion about Dad's financial arrangements that we need to sort out. A pause. Some accounts we weren't aware of. I noticed he said we. Not I. He was already making it collective, already building the team framing. I'm not sure what confusion you mean, I said, which was not technically a lie because I wasn't confused at all. Margaret. The evenness cracked slightly. Just slightly. There are shares, in a company, in Vermont, that apparently have your name on them. And I think there may have been some misunderstanding when Dad set that up. Possibly when he wasn't entirely what, Stephen? Silence. He had walked directly up to the word and couldn't say it, because saying it out loud, to me, on the phone, would mean committing to the incompetency argument in a direct conversation that could be noted, remembered, referenced. And something in him, maybe the same legal instinct he'd inherited from his father, activated too late, was telling him to stop. We should meet in person, he said instead. The 3 of us. You and me and Catherine. Just to talk through everything like adults. The phrase like adults landed in my ear with the specific weight of every time it had been used against me over 40 years. Every time I'd been the one expected to be reasonable, to be gracious, to be the adult in a room full of people who had been unkind to me since the day I walked into their family. I'll have my attorney reach out to yours, I said pleasantly. She's very good, by the way. You may have heard of her. Patricia Wren, out of Burlington. Another silence. Longer this time. Patricia Wren's reputation, it turned out, was known in the right circles. Nathan had told me as much. The pause on Stephen's end of the line told me he'd recognized the name. We don't need to make this adversarial, he said, and his voice had changed. The control was still there, but underneath it now was something new. Something I had almost never heard from Stephen Morrison in 40 years of knowing him. Uncertainty. I agree completely, I said. Have your attorney call Patricia. She's expecting to hear from someone. I hung up. I stood in the kitchen of my house in Harlan Creek for a moment, and then I went back outside to watch the Cardinals. And I noticed my hands were completely still. Catherine called 4 hours later. Where Stephen was controlled, Catherine was surgical. She had always been the more dangerous of the two, in my estimation, because she never let you see her working. Stephen wore his ambition loudly. Catherine wore hers like a second skin, so natural you could forget it was there until it had already done what it came to do. She didn't open with pleasantries. I don't know what you think you're doing, she said, her voice carrying that particular tone of someone who has decided to skip the preliminary rounds. But I want you to understand something clearly. Whatever my father may have set up in some confused arrangement toward the end of his life, it's not going to hold. He wasn't well, Margaret, you know that, everyone knows that. Robert was sharp until 3 weeks before he died, Catherine. His physicians documented that repeatedly. Physicians say what they're told to say. I let that sit in the air for a moment. Do they? I said. I'm trying to give you an opportunity here, she said, shifting gears with the ease of someone who has prepared multiple angles. We can handle this privately without it becoming unpleasant. You take the life insurance, you keep the little house, and we move forward. No attorneys, no courts, no one's reputation in the papers. There it was. The offer. Dressed up as generosity, delivered as a warning. Whose reputation concerns you, Catherine? I asked. A beat. I'm trying to be reasonable, she said. I know you are, I said. and I want you to know I genuinely appreciate it. Please have your attorney contact Patricia Wren." I hung up before she could answer. I sat down at the folding table in my kitchen, and I wrote both conversations down in a notebook word for word as close as I could remember them, because Patricia had told me on day one to document every contact, every conversation, every voicemail, every text. Keep records of everything. Date and time, every entry. I had 40 years of practice making things run smoothly and making sure every detail was accounted for. Stephen and Catherine were about to find out what happened when that skill set was redirected. Michael called that evening. I almost didn't answer. After the weight of the previous 2 calls, I was sitting on the porch with tea, watching the creek through the bare branches, trying to let the quiet do what quiet does. When his name appeared on my screen, I genuinely considered letting it go to voicemail. But Michael had always been different. Not kind exactly. He had his father's complexity without his father's compass, at least for most of his adult life. But different. And I was tired of making decisions out of self-protection. I'd done that for too many years. I answered, "Margaret." His voice was, I don't know how to describe it precisely, flatter than Stephen's performance of control, less targeted than Catherine's surgical delivery. It sounded like someone who had been arguing with himself for hours before picking up the phone. I heard about the filing. "I assumed you would," I said. "Stephen he's pretty worked up." "I imagine." A long pause, the kind that has something in it. "I didn't know," Michael said, "about any of it. The accounts, the Vermont thing, none of it. I want you to know that." "Okay," I said. And I didn't." He stopped. Started again. "The will, the way it was set up. I didn't know it was going to be like that. Stephen told me it was standard, that you'd be taken care of through the insurance, that it was all. I signed some things he asked me to sign and I didn't." He stopped again. I closed my eyes briefly. "What did you sign, Michael?" I said very carefully. Another pause. "I think," he said slowly, "I think I need to talk to my own attorney before I say anything else." "That's probably wise," I said. "Margaret." His voice dropped in a way that surprised me. "I'm sorry for a lot of things. Not just this. For a long time. I didn't say it's okay because it wasn't entirely okay, and I had spent too many years saying that things were okay when they weren't. But I also didn't hang up. I know," I said instead, "and I meant it in the way you mean something when you've been carrying it so long that the weight of it has become part of your posture." After I hung up, I sat on the porch for a long time. Michael's call was going to matter, not in the way he probably imagined when he made it, not as a simple apology that closed a chapter. It was going to matter in a specific, practical, legal way that Patricia was going to be very interested in when I told her about it the next morning. Because Michael had just told me, in his halting, guilty, I should talk to my attorney way, that Stephen had asked him to sign things. Documents, related to the estate, related to the incompetency strategy, and Michael had signed them without fully understanding what they said, which meant Stephen had used his own brother as an instrument in a legal strategy he hadn't fully disclosed to him, which meant Michael was not just a witness. Michael was potentially a victim. And victims, Patricia had explained to me on day one with that particular calm that made her so formidable, make the best witnesses. I told Nathan about the calls the next morning over coffee in the kitchen of the house that had been mine for 7 years without my knowing it. He listened without interrupting, which I had already come to understand was characteristic of him. He was one of those rare people who listens to the whole thing before responding, who doesn't use the time while you're talking to prepare what he's going to say next. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "How are you feeling?" he said. Not what do you think we should do or what did Patricia say or any of the practical forward-moving questions that would have been entirely appropriate. Just, how are you feeling? I looked at him across the folding table with its coffee rings and its stacks of documents, and I thought about the question seriously before I answered. The way it deserved to be answered. Like something is coming, I said. Something that was a long time in the making. And I don't know exactly what shape it's going to take yet. But I'm not afraid of it. Nathan nodded slowly, looking at me in that measured way of his. "Robert said something to me once," he said. He said, "The people who underestimate Margaret have always done it because she made it easy for them. She was so good at the work of being invisible that they forgot she was paying attention the whole time." I looked at the creek through the kitchen window. "He wasn't wrong," I said. Nathan almost smiled again. "Nathan." That almost smile I was starting to recognize as the real one, more honest than a full smile arrived at rather than performed. "No," he said. He really wasn't. "I want to tell you about the morning everything broke open, but before I get there I need to set the scene properly, because context is everything with something like this, and I don't want you to miss the weight of it." It had been 11 days since I'd walked out of Gerald Holt's office in Brookline with a rusty key and a brown envelope, and the particular kind of humiliation that settles into your bones rather than your skin. 11 days since I'd driven 4.5 hours to a town I'd never heard of and found, waiting for me on the other side of an iron key. An entire life that had been built in silence specifically for this moment. In those 11 days, I had done more practical, forward-moving, intentional living than I had managed in the previous decade. I had met with Patricia Wren twice in person. She drove down from Burlington in a sensible gray sedan and sat at my folding kitchen table with a legal pad and a thermos of her own coffee, which told me everything I needed to know about her. And what we had assembled together in that kitchen was not just a legal response to Stephen and Catherine's inevitable challenge. It was a case. A real one. A documented, sourced, time-stamped, witnessed case that had Robert's fingerprints all over it. Not literally, but in the way that a careful person leaves traces of their intention everywhere, if you know how to look. Patricia knew how to look. That was essentially her entire skill set applied to human behavior, and watching her work was one of the more quietly impressive things I had ever witnessed. Let me tell you about Patricia Wren properly, because she deserves it. She was 53 years old and had the energy of someone who had decided somewhere in her late 30s that she was done performing ease for other people's comfort. She was compact and precise in her movements, the kind of person whose desk you imagine being perfectly organized not because she's rigid, but because she genuinely thinks better in order. Her hair was silver and dark in equal measure, and she wore it pulled back with a clip that looked like it had been chosen once, decades ago, and never reconsidered. She had a habit of tapping her pen against her legal pad 3 times before she said something important. Not nervously, but rhythmically, like a conductor signaling the orchestra. Once I noticed it, I couldn't unnotice it. She didn't comfort, she didn't reassure. She informed and she strategized, and she occasionally said things that were so precisely cutting about opposing counsel that I had to remind myself she was on my side. I trusted her completely within approximately 45 minutes of our first meeting. Some people you just know. The case Patricia was building rested on several pillars, and she walked me through each one with the kind of thoroughness that made me feel, for the first time in a very long time, like someone was taking me seriously as a person with full cognitive capacity and legitimate standing. The first pillar was the share transfer itself. Clean, legal, documented, predating every move Stephen had made by years. This was the foundation, and it was solid. Stephen could challenge it, but he would lose that challenge, and Patricia's job was to make the process of losing it as expensive and public as possible. The second pillar was the documentation Robert's personal attorney, a man named Franklin Cross, who was nothing like Gerald Holt, who had clearly understood exactly who his client was and what he was trying to protect, had assembled over the last 3 years of Robert's life. This documentation included records of Stephen's attempts to influence Robert's financial decisions, copies of communications between Stephen and a second attorney regarding the incompetency strategy, and 3 signed, witnessed statements from individuals who had direct knowledge of pressure being applied to Robert during the period when he was ill. 3 witnesses. Robert had found 3 people willing to put their names on paper and describe what Stephen had been doing. I thought about my husband sitting in his off-limits study, pressing his pen hard into paper, building this case quietly while his son sat 2 floors above him at holiday dinners, making toasts about family. The third pillar was Michael. After his phone call, Michael had done what he said he was going to do. He'd gotten his own attorney, a straightforward man from Boston named Gerald Park, who was nothing like Gerald Holt either. And through that attorney, he had begun a process of full disclosure about what he had signed and what he had been told those documents meant versus what they actually said. What Michael had signed, it turned out, was a supporting declaration for the incompetency petition, a document in which he had attested to witnessing behaviors in his father consistent with cognitive decline. Stephen had told him it was a standard elder care protection form. Standard elder care protection. Michael had signed it in a hotel lobby in 20 minutes between meetings because Stephen had told him it was urgent and routine and not to worry about the details. The details, as Michael's new attorney had explained to him in terms that apparently left him sitting in silence for a long time, were not routine. The details were the deliberate, documented exploitation of an adult sibling for the purpose of advancing a fraudulent legal strategy. Michael was angry. Not the performance of anger, the real kind, the slow-burning kind that comes when someone you trusted has used you as a tool, and you've only just understood the full shape of what was done. Patricia described him as an ideal witness because he wasn't vengeful or dramatic. He was simply a man telling the truth about what had happened to him, which is the most effective kind of testimony there is. The morning everything broke open was a Thursday. I know it was a Thursday because I had just gotten off a call with Patricia at 8:45, and I had written Thursday, 8:45 a.m. Patricia. Final prep in my notebook with the specific satisfaction of someone crossing something off a very long list. We had been working toward a formal filing that would respond to Stephen and Catherine's challenge to the share transfer and simultaneously introduce the documented evidence of Stephen's incompetency scheme into the record. Patricia had a phrase she used for this kind of legal maneuver. She called it opening the window. The idea being that you're not just defending your position, you're letting in air. You're letting the outside world see what's been happening inside the house. And once that window is open, she said, tapping her pen 3 times, it's very difficult to close it again. The filing was scheduled for that afternoon. What happened at 9:15 that morning was not part of the plan. Nathan knocked on my front door. I had a front door now, a real one, sage green to match the house, with a brass knocker shaped like a leaf that I'd found in a box in the hall closet and hung myself. And when I opened it, he was standing on the porch with his phone in his hand, and an expression I hadn't seen on him before. Not alarm exactly. More like the controlled alertness of someone who has just received information that changes the terrain. Stephen called me, he said. I stepped back and let him in. We sat at the kitchen table. The folding table had been replaced by this point with an actual table I'd found at a second-hand shop in town. Round and solid and made from some kind of dark wood that had clearly had a long life before it got to me, which I liked about it. And Nathan put his phone face up between us. He called me directly, Nathan said, not through an attorney. My personal cell. How did he get your personal number? I don't know yet. That's worth finding out. He paused. He wants to meet. Just the 2 of us, he said. Man to man, he said. The phrase, man to man, landed in the kitchen with a kind of dull thud. What did you tell him? I said. I told him I'd think about it and call him back. Nathan looked at me steadily. I wanted to talk to you first. I appreciated that more than I said. I was still getting used to people consulting me rather than informing me after decisions had already been made. What do you think he wants? I said. I think he's scared, Nathan said. I think someone in his circle has told him enough about Patricia's reputation that he's realized the filing this afternoon is going to be significantly worse for him than he anticipated. And I think he's trying to find a side door. And he thinks you're the side door. He thinks I'm the side door. Nathan confirmed. He thinks that because I'm a businessman, he can appeal to me in business terms. Offer me something. Find a number that makes this go away. I looked at the dark wood table for a moment. At the grain of it, the years visible in it. Are you going to meet him? I said. Nathan picked up his phone and turned it over once in his hand. I think I am, he said. But not because he asked me to. Here is what I want you to understand about Nathan Calloway, and I'm telling you this because it matters to what happened next and it matters to how I understood him, which was changing slowly and continuously in those days in ways I was still only partially aware of. Nathan was not a man who did things for simple reasons. He had a quality that I think comes from having been through genuine loss, from having stood at the place where things end and having had to decide, from that place what to rebuild and how. And that quality was a kind of clear-eyed purposefulness that had nothing performative about it. He didn't make moves. He made decisions. There's a difference, and you can feel it. He had known Robert for 11 years. He had been trusted with something significant, and he had carried that trust carefully. But he was also, and this was what I was beginning to understand, genuinely angry about what had been done to me. Not on Robert's behalf, on mine. He'd read the documents. He'd heard the calls I'd described. He had sat across from me at that folding table, and later at the second-hand table, and listened to 40 years of a life being outlined, and somewhere in that listening, he had formed a view of Stephen and Catherine Morrison that was not warm. He was going to meet Stephen, but he was going to meet him with a recorder running and Patricia Wren on standby, and the full legal weight of everything we had assembled pointing directly at the door Stephen was about to walk through, thinking it was a way out. They met at a restaurant in Burlington. Neutral ground, Nathan had suggested when he called Stephen back. Stephen had agreed immediately, which told me he thought he was the one doing the maneuvering. I wasn't there in person. I was sitting in my house in Harlan Creek with a cup of tea and my notebook, and a level of focused calm that surprised me. Honestly, I had expected to feel anxious. I didn't. I felt the way you feel when something that has been building for a long time is finally arriving, and the waiting is almost over. Not excited, not triumphant, just present. Solid. Like those oak trees out front. Nathan called me at 2:17, just under 3 hours after the meeting started. "How did it go?" I said, which was possibly the most understated question I had asked in my entire life. "He offered me money," Nathan said. "A significant amount. To walk away from the board position and to," and this is a direct quote, "encourage Margaret to accept a reasonable settlement rather than pursuing an embarrassing public process." The word embarrassing. Of course. "He said embarrassing," I said. "He said embarrassing," Nathan confirmed. He was referring, I think, to the idea that airing family financial disputes in court reflects poorly on everyone involved. Did he explain why the shares aren't legitimately mine? He tried 3 different arguments. First was the incompetency angle. He's still holding on to that even though it's collapsing. Second was that Robert had a, and I want to get this right because the exact wording matters, a diminished understanding of the appropriate distribution of marital assets in his later years, which I believe his attorney will eventually translate into something legally coherent. But right now sounds like a man saying his father didn't know what he was doing when he chose his wife over his children. I was quiet for a moment. "And the third argument?" I said. "The third argument," Nathan said, and there was something in his voice that was different. A controlled quality that I recognized by now as the register he used when he was containing something strong, was that you had exerted undue influence over Robert, that you had, over the course of the marriage, manipulated a man who was, his word, lonely, into prioritizing you over his legitimate heirs. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the creek was doing what it always did, indifferent and continuous and silver through the bare branches. "Lonely," I said. That was his word. I thought about 40 years. I thought about Easter dinners and graduation ceremonies and Christmas mornings and the garden in 1998, and a man who pressed his pen hard into paper when something mattered. I thought about a town called Harlan Creek, and a house painted sage green, and a letter written in slightly uneven handwriting that said, "I should have chosen you out loud." "Nathan," I said. "Yes." "Did you get all of that on the recorder?" A pause. And then, for the first time since I'd known him, Nathan Calloway laughed. Not a polite laugh, or a managed laugh. A real one, sudden and genuine, the kind that comes out of somewhere unexpected. "Every single word," he said. Patricia filed at 4:15 that afternoon. I won't walk you through all the legal details because, honestly, even I find them dense, and I lived through them. What I will tell you is that the filing included the full documentation of Stephen's incompetency strategy, the 3 witness statements, the records of undue influence attempts, The hotel lobby declaration that Michael had signed without understanding and, critically freshly, added that afternoon after Nathan transcribed the recording, a detailed account of Stephen Morrison offering a financial inducement to a company executive in exchange for influencing the outcome of a legal proceeding. Which is not just ethically problematic, which is, Patricia explained to me over the phone at 4:45 with that precise, unflashy satisfaction of hers, potentially criminal. What happens now? I asked. 3 taps of the pen. Now, she said. We opened the window. The filing became public record the following morning. I don't want to get into the details of how news travels in legal and professional circles, because that could take another hour to explain, and it's not really the point. The point is that by Friday afternoon, Stephen Morrison's professional reputation, which he had spent his entire adult life carefully constructing, which he wore like a second identity, which was in many ways more important to him than his actual identity, had begun to crack. He was a corporate consultant. His entire business was built on being trusted by other companies with sensitive decisions. When the filing became searchable and the nature of its contents began to circulate among the kind of people who read such things, 2 of his current clients made quiet inquiries through their own attorneys. One of them didn't wait for answers. Catherine fared differently, and in some ways worse. Catherine was a real estate attorney. The documentation that emerged about her role in the estate manipulation, specifically a series of emails between her and Stephen that Franklin Cross had obtained and preserved, in which she discussed strategies for ensuring I received as little as possible, and in which she referred to me in terms I will not repeat in this forum. Those emails were going to be very interesting to the State Bar Association's Ethics Committee, which Patricia had already notified existed as an option. I didn't file the bar complaint that Friday. Patricia advised patience. Let the weight of the filing settle first, she said. Let them understand the full landscape before the next thing arrives. Give them the weekend with what they know and what they don't know, and let the uncertainty do its own work. I thought that was wise. I spent that Friday evening on my wraparound porch in the last of the November light, with the oak trees going dark against the sky and the creek audible from where I sat if I was quiet enough, and Nathan brought dinner from the diner. Actual food, not just coffee, for the first time since those first days. And we sat on the porch steps and ate and talked about things that had nothing to do with lawyers or filings or any of it. He told me about Sadie, his daughter, about how she wanted to study environmental science and had opinions about watershed conservation that she delivered with the passionate authority of a 17-year-old who has discovered something worth caring about how she could spend an entire Saturday by the creek with a notebook and come home with pages of observations and be genuinely happy in a way that he said still surprised him sometimes. The kind of happiness that doesn't need much, that finds what it needs in what's already there. He talked about her the way parents talk about their children when they're genuinely proud. Not the performance of pride, but the real thing, the kind that's threaded through with wonder. I told him about the garden. The real one, the one in 1998. I hadn't told anyone that story in 27 years, and I told it carefully, in pieces, and he listened the way he always listened, completely, without rushing me toward the end of it. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. That garden is probably still there, he said. In Brookline. It is, I said. I drove past it once a few years ago. It had gotten overgrown. Maybe one day, he said. And then he stopped, and I let him stop, because he was right that it wasn't a sentence that needed finishing yet. We sat in the dark for a while after that, listening to the creek, and it was the most comfortable silence I'd sat in for longer than I could clearly remember. The weekend passed. Monday came, and Monday was the day Catherine made the mistake that changed everything. I need to tell you about Catherine's mistake carefully, because it wasn't loud or dramatic the way you might expect from someone who had always been the most controlled person in any room she entered. It wasn't a scene. It wasn't a confrontation. It was the kind of mistake that only very intelligent, very proud people make. The kind that comes from being so accustomed to winning that you genuinely cannot conceive of a situation where you've already lost. It came in the form of a phone call to Michael. Not to me. Not to Patricia. Not even to Nathan. To Michael. Her own brother, the one who had signed documents he didn't understand in a hotel lobby, The one who had called me with that halting, guilty voice and said I'm sorry, for a lot of things, for a long time. The one who was now represented by his own attorney and had begun the process of full disclosure that was quietly dismantling Stephen's strategy from the inside. Catherine called Michael on that Monday morning at 7:52. I know the exact time because Michael's attorney had advised him to log all contact from family members related to the estate matter, and Michael, who had apparently decided that if he was going to do this thing, he was going to do it completely, had been keeping meticulous records. He told me about the call himself 3 days later, sitting across from me at my second-hand table with a cup of coffee, and the expression of a man who was still processing the fact that his sister had treated him the way she had. He walked me through it almost word for word from his notes, and as he spoke I had the specific sensation of watching someone finally see a thing clearly that they had been half seeing for decades. Catherine had not called to apologize. She had not called to check on him. She had called to deliver a message, and the message, stripped of its careful professional language, was this: get back in line, remember where your loyalties are, withdraw your disclosure, and we will handle this as a family. She had used the word family 4 times in a 7-minute conversation. She had reminded him that their mother, their biological mother, Robert's first wife, who had been gone for 20 years, would have wanted them to stand together. She had said, and Michael read this from his notes with a flat, careful voice, that my presence in their family had always been a disruption, that I had never truly been one of them, and that protecting what their father had built meant protecting it from people who had inserted themselves into a situation they had no right to. Michael had listened to the entire thing without interrupting. Then he had said, very quietly, Catherine, I'm going to have to let my attorney know about this call. And Catherine, for possibly the first time in her adult life, had not had an immediate response. When Michael came to see me that Wednesday, I want to be honest about what that visit was like, because it would be easy to make it into something tidy and resolved, and it wasn't entirely either of those things. He was 54 years old, and he looked, when he sat down at my table, like a man who had been doing a significant amount of thinking in a short period of time, and had arrived somewhere he hadn't expected to be. He was the youngest of the 3, and he had his father's eyes, the same quality of looking at something directly that Robert had, though in Michael it had always been less steady, more conflicted, like a compass in a room with too much iron. He looked around the kitchen when he came in. At the table, the mismatched chairs, the window facing the creek, the small watercolor of the main lake I'd hung on the wall near the door. I watched him take in the space, and I watched something move across his face that I didn't try to name. This is nice, he said. It is, I agreed. I made coffee. We sat. He told me about Catherine's call, and I listened without interrupting and wrote it down in my notebook while he talked, which he watched me do without comment. When he finished, he wrapped both hands around his mug and looked at the table. I owe you more than an apology, he said. I know that. You don't owe me anything right now, I said. What you're doing with your attorney is enough. It's not, though. He looked up. I watched them treat you, the way they treated you for years. And I told myself it wasn't my business to get in the middle of a family dynamic, which was, he stopped, which was cowardice. I just didn't call it that. I thought about all the dinners, all the Christmas mornings, all the moments when a word from him would have cost him something small and meant something large, and the word hadn't come. People do what they can manage, I said. Sometimes that's not very much. You're being more generous than I deserve. Probably, I said. But I'm 68 years old, and I don't have the energy anymore for withholding generosity from people who are genuinely trying. He almost smiled at that. And for a second, just a second, I could see Robert in his face. Not the features exactly, but something behind them. That quality of arriving somewhere unexpected and finding it more solid than anticipated. We talked for 2 hours. Not about the case, mostly. About Robert. About the years. About things that had happened that neither of us had ever discussed directly, and that turned out to be both more painful and more necessary to talk about than I had expected. He left in the early afternoon with the particular quiet of someone who has put something down that they've been carrying a long time. I stood in the doorway and watched his car disappear around the corner, and then I went back to my table and sat for a while with my notebook open and didn't write anything in it. Nathan came by that evening and I told him about the visit. He listened all the way through. "How do you feel about him?" he asked. Not what do you think about the legal implications. Not what does Patricia say, just how do you feel? Complicated, I said honestly, but not badly. Nathan nodded, like that was the right answer. Patricia called Thursday morning, 3 rings, which meant she was calling from her car. She had a specific pattern. Office calls were 2 rings before pickup. Car calls were 3. Urgent calls were immediate. I had learned this without meaning to. Catherine's attorney contacted me yesterday afternoon, she said. No preamble, which was also characteristic. They want to discuss a settlement. I sat down. Already, I said. The bar referral moved faster than I expected, Patricia said. There was something in her voice that was not quite satisfaction, but was in that neighborhood. I made some calls Friday afternoon after we spoke. The ethics committee doesn't move quickly as a rule, but when you provide documentation rather than allegations, the timeline changes. Catherine received a notification Monday. The Monday morning phone call to Michael. The desperation underneath the controlled language. The 4 uses of the word family. She panicked, I said. She made a decision from panic, which is different from panicking, Patricia said. She's still trying to manage the outcome. But her leverage is essentially gone and her attorney knows it. What are they offering? Patricia told me. I want to be careful here again about specifics for legal reasons. But I will say that what Catherine's attorney had put on the table was not the settlement of someone who believed they had a strong position. It was the settlement of someone trying to limit damage. It acknowledged the validity of the share transfer. It dropped the incompetency challenge entirely. It included a non-disclosure agreement, which Patricia had already told them was a non-starter, and a clause releasing Catherine from any future claims related to the estate, which Patricia had also already indicated was going to require significant discussion. What do you want to do? Patricia asked. 3 taps of the pen, faint through the phone. I want to think about it for 24 hours, I said. That's wise, she said. I'll tell them you're considering. After I hung up, I put on my coat and walked down to the creek. The creek in November was clear and cold and ran over smooth, dark stones with a sound that was almost musical in its consistency. There was a wooden bench someone had placed at the end of Millbrook Lane, weathered gray, that I had started thinking of as mine in the casual, possessive way you claim things in a place that's starting to feel like home. I sat on the bench, and I thought about what I wanted. This is harder than it sounds. 40 years of want had been directed outward, toward making things work, keeping things smooth, filling in gaps that weren't mine to fill. I had become so practiced at wanting things for other people, on other people's behalf, that sitting alone and asking myself the straightforward question of what I wanted felt genuinely unfamiliar. What I wanted was not revenge. I want to be clear about that, because I think some of you reading this might be waiting for the part where I describe wanting to destroy them, and I understand why. I've read enough of those stories on here to know that the revenge fantasy is a real and human thing. But that's not what was sitting in my chest when I thought about Stephen and Catherine. What I wanted was for it to be seen. Not by me. I had seen it for 40 years. Not by Robert. He had built an entire quiet empire out of having seen it. I wanted it to be seen by the world they had spent their entire lives performing for. The professional world, the social world, the world where reputation is currency and image is everything, and where Stephen and Catherine Morrison had coasted on their father's name and their tailored clothes and their careful presentation for decades. I wanted the window open. Fully open. Not cracked. Not managed. Not partially open in exchange for a clean settlement that let them walk away quietly. Patricia had a word for what I was describing. Trial. I called her back the next morning. Tell them no, I said. A pause. Margaret, I want to make sure you understand the full scope of what that means. A trial is... I understand the full scope, I said. I've been living in the full scope for 11 days and I was living in the context of it for 40 years. Tell them no. 3 taps. All right, she said, and something in her voice had shifted, not surprised but recalibrated, like a person who has just confirmed a hypothesis they quietly held all along. I'll notify opposing counsel this afternoon. Patricia, I said. Yes. How confident are you? A pause that was not uncertain, just honest. On the share transfer, completely. On the fraud and undue influence documentation, very. On the criminal referral for the bribery attempt, that's not mine to predict. That goes to a different process. But the civil case? Margaret, I have 3 witnesses, a recorded offer of financial inducement, email correspondence between 2 attorneys discussing deliberate elder manipulation, a co-signatory who is flipped, and a share transfer that predates everything they've tried to use against you by years. 3 taps. I'm confident. I looked out my kitchen window at the oak trees. Good, I said. Let's open the window. I'm going to skip over the next several weeks in this telling, not because nothing happened, but because what happened was largely procedural, and I don't want to put you through the specific texture of legal process because it's genuinely not interesting to experience, and even less interesting to read about. What I will tell you is that during those weeks I did something I hadn't done in a very long time. I lived. Not performed living. Not filled time. Actually lived, in the specific, daily, present tense way that had been so crowded out by the business of being someone's wife and someone's step-anything and someone's hostess and someone's support system that I had almost forgotten what it felt like. I furnished the house. Not all at once, not with the anxious thoroughness of someone trying to fill space, but slowly, thoughtfully, picking things up at the second-hand shop on Main Street and the Saturday market 2 towns over, choosing things because I liked them, not because they matched or because a guest might approve. A lamp with a ceramic base the color of old amber. A bookshelf I painted myself a deep navy blue, badly at first and then better. A kitchen table runner in a rust and cream pattern that reminded me of something I couldn't name but found comforting. The main watercolor on the wall, which I moved 3 times before I found the spot where it looked exactly right. I got to know Harlan Creek properly. The woman who ran the hardware store, Barbara, who had opinions about weather and wood stain and very little else and gave both with equal authority. The owner of the diner, a man named Pete who had apparently been in quiet love with Doris for approximately 11 years and been spectacularly unsuccessful in doing anything about it, which was a situation I found both charming and exasperating in equal measure. The 2 women who walked their dogs past my house every morning at 7:30, always deep in conversation, never the same topic twice in the weeks I observed them. Small things, ordinary things, the specific texture of a life that is actually yours. Nathan and I had dinner twice that week, once at the diner, once at my kitchen table where I cooked for the first time in a month, and discovered that cooking for someone you enjoy talking to is an entirely different experience from cooking for obligation. He brought wine, a Burgundy that was better than anything I'd have chosen, and we talked for 4 hours and I only noticed it had been 4 hours when I looked at the clock and felt genuinely surprised. I want to be careful about how I describe what was developing between us because I think it would be easy to make it sound like a neat narrative progression, and it wasn't that. It was slower and quieter and more uncertain than a narrative progression, and I think that's actually what made it real. There was an evening in mid-December. I remember because the first real snow had come, just a few inches, and it had changed the sound of the town into that specific muffled quiet that snow creates, like the world has put its hand over its own mouth. When Nathan and I were sitting on my porch after dinner, both of us with blankets and the particular stubbornness of people who don't want to go inside yet, watching the snow fall past the porch light in slow, individual pieces. He said, "I want to tell you something, and I'm going to ask you in advance to let me get all the way through it before you respond." I said, "Okay," he said. "I knew when Robert first talked to me about you that you were someone I wanted to meet. Not in any... It wasn't... I just understood from the way he talked about you that you were a particular kind of person that I don't think I'd met before. And then you walked into that diner 3 weeks ago and you sat down across from me and said, 'Tell me everything,' and you meant it. Not just the financial details. Everything, the real shape of it, and I've been thinking about that every day since. He stopped. He was looking at the snow. I'm not saying this with I don't have an agenda here. I know your life just changed completely, and I know you're in the middle of something enormous, and I'm not trying to add to that. I just thought you should know that the way you've handled all of this, the intelligence of it, the patience of it, the dignity of it, I think it's one of the most remarkable things I've ever been close to. The snow fell past the porch light. I let him be all the way done, then I said, Nathan, I'm 68 years old and I have been invisible in my own life for 40 years, and I am tired of pretending that things aren't what they are, because the timing isn't perfect. The timing will never be perfect. He looked at me then. No, he said. It probably won't. I know what you're saying, I said. And I want you to know I hear it. We sat in the snow quiet for a while after that, and when I finally went inside, I stood in my kitchen for a moment, just letting the warmth settle around me, and I thought, this is what it feels like when something is beginning rather than ending. It felt remarkable. It felt entirely new. It felt, if I'm honest, like something I had waited for my whole life without knowing clearly enough what I was waiting for. The trial date was set for February. Patricia called me the second week of January with an update that reframed the entire remaining arc of what was coming. Stephen's attorney had filed a motion to have certain evidence excluded. Patricia had opposed it. The judge had denied the motion. Stephen's attorney had filed a second motion. Patricia had opposed that one too, and the judge had denied it with what Patricia described as increasing impatience with opposing counsel, which she said in the specific tone of someone who has gotten that particular result before and finds it professionally gratifying. Catherine's bar proceeding had moved into its formal investigation phase. She had retained a second attorney specifically for that process. The cost of defending herself in two simultaneous proceedings, Patricia noted, was significant. Significant enough that Catherine had quietly listed her apartment in Boston with a real estate agent in early January. One of the documents in the estate file showed that Catherine's financial position had been considerably dependent on the inheritance she had expected to receive cleanly and quickly. Without it, and with substantial legal fees accumulating, she was in real trouble. Stephen's consulting practice had lost 3 clients. Not dramatically, not all at once. Quietly. The way trust leaves, not in a wave but in a gradual tide going out. I thought about what Patricia had said weeks earlier, about how leverage disappears, about how the people who are accustomed to winning do their worst work when they're losing, because they haven't developed the skill set for it. Stephen and Catherine had spent their whole lives winning. They had won by positioning, by maneuvering, by using their father's name and their mother's memory and their professional credentials and the sheer force of their certainty that they were the legitimate heirs of everything Robert Morrison had built. And now they were learning something new. They were learning what it feels like when the thing you were so certain was yours turns out to have belonged to someone else the whole time. I thought about that on a January morning, standing in my kitchen with coffee, looking out at the creek, which had partly frozen at the edges but still ran dark and continuous down the middle. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that too. What I felt was something quieter and more durable than triumph. I felt like myself. For the first time in a very long time, in a house that was mine, in a town that was starting to know my name, with oak trees out front and a creek at the end of the road and a man who had told me something true on a snowy porch and meant every word of it, I felt completely, solidly, undeniably like myself. February came in cold and clear, the kind of cold that Harlan Creek did differently from anywhere I'd lived before. Not the damp, heavy cold of Brookline winters that pressed against the windows and made the house feel besieged, but a dry, bright cold that made everything sharp and distinct. The bare oak trees out front throwing long, precise shadows across the snow-covered yard in the early morning light, like something drawn in ink. I had been in this town for 3 months. 3 months. I kept turning that number over in my mind during those first days of February because it seemed simultaneously too short and too long. Too short to explain how completely my life had been remade. Too long to account for how naturally it had all settled into place. The house didn't feel new anymore. It felt like mine in the deep, unquestioned way That only happens when a place has absorbed you and you've absorbed it back, when you stop noticing the things you chose and start simply living among them. Doris had become a genuine friend, the kind that arrives late in life and surprises you with its completeness. She had a directness that I found deeply restful after decades of navigating subtext and performance, and a laugh that came from somewhere low and real and that she deployed without apology. We had coffee together 3 mornings a week at her kitchen table, which was the best-used piece of furniture I had ever encountered, scarred and solid and hosting at any given time a combination of coffee cups, seed catalogs, legal pads, and the enormous orange cat named Senator, who had apparently lived there for 11 years and had opinions about everything. Barbara from the hardware store had taught me how to recaulk a window frame, which I had done badly and then adequately, and then well, working through the 3 stages with the particular satisfaction of learning something practical with your hands. Pete from the diner had started saving me a specific table by the window on Wednesday mornings without my asking, which was the kind of small, unrequested kindness that accumulates into something that feels like belonging. And Nathan. Nathan came by most evenings. Not all of them. He had a life, a daughter, a company to run, 100 obligations that existed entirely independently of me, which I found I valued rather than resented. He wasn't there because he had nowhere else to be. He was there because he wanted to be, which is a distinction that matters enormously when you've spent 40 years being someone's default rather than someone's choice. We had settled into a rhythm that felt natural in the way that only genuinely right things feel natural, not effortless. Because nothing real is effortless but fitting, like 2 people who have both been through enough to stop performing and can simply be honest about what they want and what they have to offer and what they're still figuring out. There were evenings we talked for hours about everything, and evenings we sat on the porch in comfortable quiet. And evenings he helped me hang shelves badly, and then rehang them properly, and we laughed about it in the specific warm way that shared incompetence creates between people who aren't trying to impress each other anymore. Sadie came to Harlan Creek the last weekend of January, ostensibly to see her father actually, I suspected, partly out of curiosity about me. She was 17, and had her father's quality of full attention, and her own quality of saying exactly what she thought with a directness that was slightly startling and entirely refreshing. She spent Saturday afternoon at the creek with her notebook, came back for dinner, and sat across the table from me with the frank, evaluative look of a young person who has decided to form their own opinion, and is not going to pretend otherwise. She asked me 3 questions over dinner that I remember clearly. The first was about the Viridian shares. She had clearly been briefed, and what I intended to do with them, which was a more sophisticated question than most adults had asked me. The second was about what I had done before Robert, before the marriage, before the 40 years who I had been at 25. What I had wanted, what I had thought my life was going to look like. That question surprised me enough that I sat with it for a moment before answering, and what came out was more honest than I had expected, and she listened to the whole thing without looking at her phone once. The third question she asked toward the end of dinner, with the directness of someone who has decided the conversation has earned it. She said, "Do you make my dad happy? Like, actually, not in a polite way." Nathan made a sound beside me that was halfway between a cough and a laugh. I looked at her directly. "I think we make each other better," I said, which I've come to believe is more durable than happy. She looked at me for a moment. Then she nodded once, the way her father nodded, quiet and certain, arrived at rather than performed. "Okay," she said, and went back to her food. Nathan reached under the table and briefly squeezed my hand. That was the moment, I think, if I had to name one. The trial began on a Tuesday. Burlington in February is a particular kind of beautiful that nobody warns you about. The lake frozen at the edges, the mountains visible on clear days in a way that makes the city feel simultaneously grounded and vast. The old courthouse on Main Street with its granite steps and its serious 19th century confidence in the permanence of things. I wore the gray wool dress. I know what you're thinking. But it was the dress I'd been wearing when I walked out of Gerald Holt's office with a rusty key and nothing else. And I had decided somewhere in the weeks of preparation that I wanted to close that loop, that the woman who had walked out in that dress deserved to walk into this room in it too, that it wasn't a defeat dress. It had never been a defeat dress. I had just been wearing it on a day when I didn't yet know that. Patricia met me on the courthouse steps at 8:15. She was wearing a charcoal suit that looked like it had been chosen specifically for the purpose of being taken seriously, her hair in its usual clip, reading glasses already in her hand even though we hadn't gotten inside yet. She looked at me for a moment when I walked up. "You look calm," she said. "I am calm," I said. She nodded. 3 taps against her legal pad, which she was already carrying. "Good," she said. "Let's go." I want to describe the moment I saw Stephen and Catherine in the courthouse hallway, because I've been thinking about how to write this part for a while and I want to get it right. They were standing near the far end of the corridor with their respective attorneys. Stephen's a tall, tightly wound man who moved like someone perpetually braced for impact. Catherine's a woman who had the careful, neutral expression of someone paid to look unreadable. Stephen was in a suit that would have cost more than my car. Dark navy, the kind of suit that says I am a serious person who belongs in rooms like this. His jaw was set. He looked, if I'm honest, like a man who had been sleeping badly. There were shadows under his eyes that his careful grooming couldn't entirely conceal, and something in the set of his shoulders that I recognized after 40 years of watching his father in difficult situations. Not fear exactly. The particular tension of someone who has been waiting for a thing to arrive and finds that the actual arrival is worse than the anticipation. Catherine was thinner than I'd seen her in years. She was wearing a suit too, stone gray, impeccable, and she had her hair pulled back in that tight way she always did. But the lines around her mouth were deeper than I remembered, and there was something in her posture, just the faintest thing, that suggested the effort of holding it was costing more than usual. She saw me before Stephen did. Our eyes met across that courthouse hallway, and I want to tell you that there was a movie moment there. Some exchange of meaning. Some silent communication. But that's not what happened. What happened was that Catherine looked at me for approximately 3 seconds with an expression I had never seen on her face in 40 years of knowing her. And then she looked away. The expression was not anger, not contempt, not the cold calculation I had grown so used to that I could identify it in the set of her eyebrows from across a dinner table. It was the expression of someone who has finally, completely understood something they spent a very long time refusing to see. Stephen noticed me a moment later. He held my gaze for longer. That was characteristic. He was always more confrontational than Catherine in the direct ways. She did her damage indirectly. And then his attorney touched his arm and said something low and private, and Stephen looked away too. Nathan was sitting in the public gallery. He'd driven up from Harlan Creek that morning with Sadie, who had insisted on coming and whom Patricia had met briefly on the steps, with the kind of swift, accurate assessment she applied to everything, and had then pronounced, when Sadie was out of earshot, "That one's going to be formidable." He caught my eye when I walked into the courtroom and gave me that quiet, certain nod, and I felt it land in my chest in a specific, solid way. Michael was in the gallery too. He came in a few minutes after I sat down, took a seat 3 rows behind Nathan, and when I turned briefly he met my eyes and gave me a small, tight nod that cost him something, I could tell. That nod was a whole 40 years of complicated history compressed into a single gesture, and I received it as such. I am not going to walk you through the trial day by day, because a real trial is not like a television trial, and the reality of it, the hours of procedure, the lengthy examination of documents, the long stretches of technical legal testimony, would lose you in the details, and the details aren't the point. The point is what happened over 5 days in a Burlington courtroom in February. The point is 3 witnesses who had known Robert Morrison and had watched his son attempt to engineer his incompetency, taking the stand one after another and describing, in plain and specific language, what they had seen. One of them was Franklin Cross, Robert's personal attorney, who testified for 2 hours with the meticulous precision of a man who had been waiting a long time to say these things in a room where they could be heard properly. He was 71 years old and had the patient, unhurried authority of someone who has nothing left to prove and everything to document. Stephen's attorney cross-examined him for 40 minutes and accomplished essentially nothing, which Patricia described afterward as the legal equivalent of trying to scratch granite with a butter knife. The point is Michael on the witness stand on the third day. He was not a dramatic witness. He didn't cry or perform or make speeches. He simply sat there, in the careful, honest way of someone who has decided the only thing left to do is tell the truth completely, and answered Patricia's questions in full, and described the hotel lobby, and described what Stephen had told him he was signing, and described what he had later understood it actually was. Stephen's attorney objected 17 times during Michael's testimony. The judge sustained 4 of them. The remaining 13 hung in the courtroom air like weather. The point is, the recording. Nathan's testimony was the 4th day, and the recording played in full in that courtroom. Stephen's voice clear and specific and unmistakable, offering a financial inducement to a company executive in exchange for influencing a legal proceeding, was the kind of evidence that changes the texture of a room. I watched the jury. This was a civil proceeding, but certain aspects required jury involvement. And I watched what happened to their faces when they heard Stephen's voice saying the things he had said in that Burlington restaurant, believing he was managing a situation, and actually walking into the most consequential mistake of his life. Catherine's attorney had been quietly negotiating with Patricia throughout the trial. By the 4th day, those negotiations had become considerably less quiet and considerably more urgent. On the morning of the 5th day, Catherine's attorney approached Patricia before the session began. I was sitting in a conference room down the hall with coffee I wasn't drinking and my notebook open to a blank page when Patricia came in, closed the door behind her, sat down across from me and put her legal pad on the table. "Catherine wants to settle," she said. "Today, before we go back in." "What are the terms?" I said. Patricia told me. "Full acknowledgement of the validity of the share transfer. Full withdrawal of all challenges to the estate arrangements. A financial settlement that I will not specify here but which Patricia described as reflective of the full cost of what was done, covering legal fees, damages for the documented manipulation, and a figure representing the calculated value of the interference with assets that had legally been mine for years. No non-disclosure agreement. That had been Patricia's absolute requirement from the beginning, and Catherine had finally, after months of resistance, accepted it. And, this was the last item, the one Patricia delivered with a particular careful steadiness, a formal written acknowledgement signed by Catherine, that the incompetency claims made about Robert Morrison during the period of the estate proceedings were fabricated, that he had been of sound mind when he made every financial decision documented in the case, that the claims had been made knowingly and falsely in furtherance of a scheme to defraud his surviving spouse. I looked at Patricia across the conference table. "She'll sign that?" I said. "Her attorney says yes," Patricia said. "She's been advised that if this goes to the jury, and we get the verdict I think we're going to get, the bar complaint becomes significantly harder to defend. This is her off-ramp. It's a costly one, but it's the last one she has." I thought about Catherine's face in that courthouse hallway, that expression I had never seen before. "And Stephen?" I said. Patricia's expression shifted slightly. "Stephen is not settling," she said. "Stephen is still," she paused, choosing her word, "recalibrating. His attorney has advised settlement and Stephen is not listening to his attorney, which is his right and also, frankly, his problem. So the trial continues for Stephen." "The trial continues for Stephen," Patricia confirmed. "With the recording and evidence and Michael's testimony in the record, and 3 witnesses who have described in detail a pattern of elder manipulation and fraud." 3 taps. "His attorney is a competent man doing an increasingly difficult job." I looked at the blank page in my notebook. "Accept Catherine's settlement," I said, "exactly as proposed, and then let's go back in and finish." The verdict for Stephen came on a Friday afternoon. I'm going to be straightforward with you about this. The way I've tried to be straightforward about everything. I did not feel what I expected to feel when the jury foreman read it out. I had expected something large, something that announced itself. After 40 years and 3 months and everything that had happened between the first and the last, I had expected the moment of legal vindication to arrive with some kind of corresponding internal event. relief, or triumph, or the satisfying closure of a door that had been opened too long. What I felt instead was something much quieter. The verdict was comprehensive. The civil fraud finding was unanimous. The damages awarded were substantial. The full amount Patricia had argued for, plus an additional figure that the jury apparently determined on their own, based on the documentation of deliberate, sustained, premeditated conduct. Stephen's attorney sat very still when the foreman finished reading. Stephen himself, and I watched him, I won't pretend I didn't, sat with both hands flat on the table in front of him and stared at a point on the wall above the judge's bench with the specific blankness of a man whose internal narrative has just been forcibly rewritten. Patricia touched my arm briefly when it was over. Outside the courthouse on those granite steps in the February cold, with the lake visible through the buildings and the mountains pale and clear at the horizon, Nathan was waiting. He had come out while the attorneys were handling the post-verdict formalities, and he was standing with his hands in his coat pockets and his breath making small clouds in the cold air. And when I came through the door and walked down the steps toward him, he looked at me with that direct, quiet look of his and said, "How are you?" Not "you did it" or "congratulations" or any of the large words the moment might have suggested. Just, "How are you?" "I'm okay," I said. And then, "I'm better than okay. I stopped. "Take your time," he said. I looked at the mountains. "I feel like someone handed me back something I didn't know had been taken," I said. "Not the money, not the legal outcome. Something else. Something I'd been carrying the absence of for so long I'd stopped noticing the weight of it." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "Your name," he said. I looked at him. "Your own name," he said. "In your own life." I stood on those courthouse steps in my gray wool dress in the February cold, and I felt something happen in my chest that I think was the final release of something held for a very long time. Not dramatic, not cinematic. Just released, the way a knot comes undone when you finally found the right thread to pull. "Yeah," I said. "That." He offered me his arm. I took it. We walked down the rest of the steps together. "I want to tell you what happened afterward, because I think you deserve the full picture and not just the verdict." Stephen's civil verdict was forwarded to the appropriate authorities regarding the criminal referral for the bribery attempt, the recorded offer to Nathan. That process moves on its own timeline, and I am not going to speculate about outcomes, but I will tell you that Stephen's consulting practice had no clients by the end of February. Not 3 fewer. 0. The combination of the public civil verdict, the documented fraud finding, and the nature of the bribery recording made him functionally unemployable in his field. The Brookline mansion, which he and Catherine had jointly inherited and which turned out to carry significantly more debt than any of them had realized, Robert had, as Nathan had delicately suggested months earlier, made some very deliberate decisions about the mortgage in his final years, was listed for sale in March. I drove past it once in late March on a day when I had business in Boston that took me through Brookline. I didn't stop. I slowed down slightly and looked at the for sale sign on the front lawn and at the house I had lived in for 40 years. And I thought about the garden at the back that had probably grown over entirely now. And I thought about a man who pressed his pen hard into paper. And then I drove on. Catherine's bar proceedings concluded in April. The formal acknowledgement she had signed as part of our settlement was entered as evidence. Her license was suspended for 18 months with a requirement for ethics supervision upon reinstatement. Whether she returns to practice after that is her business, and genuinely not mine. Michael did something unexpected. In March, he came back to Harlan Creek. Not to see me specifically, or not only to see me, but because he had apparently decided that the town warranted a longer look. He stayed at Doris's bed and breakfast for a week. He walked the creek. He ate at Pete's Diner. On his last morning, he came to my house and we sat at my second-hand table and had coffee and talked for 2 hours, and at the end he said quietly that he thought his father had made the right choice. He meant the town. He might have meant more than the town. I told him he was welcome back any time. He came back in May. I want to close this out the right way. because I've been writing this over several evenings and I'm aware it's long and I'm aware some of you are going to read the whole thing and some of you are going to skip to the end. And I want both groups to get something true out of it. Here is what's true. I am 68 years old. I live in a sage greenhouse on Millbrook Lane in Harlan Creek, Vermont, with 2 oak trees out front and a creek at the end of the road, and a navy blue bookshelf I painted myself in the main watercolor hanging in exactly the right spot. I have a folding table I kept even after I got the real one, because I did significant work at that table and I find I don't want to let it go. I have a neighbor named Doris who makes real eggs and has a cat named Senator, and is finally, as of last month, going to dinner with Pete, which the entire town has apparently been waiting for with the patience of people who understand that some things take the time they take. I have an attorney named Patricia Wren, who I plan to have dinner with twice a year for the rest of my life because she is one of the most remarkable people I have ever met, and she deserves to be known as a person, and not just as a professional. I have a complicated, evolving, genuinely trying relationship with a man named Michael who is learning, late and imperfectly and earnestly, how to be something other than what his upbringing made him. And I find that I have more room for that than I expected. I have a daughter who isn't, Sadie, who texts me approximately 4 times a week with observations about watershed biology and questions about what I was like at 17 and photographs of things she finds interesting, which are never the things you'd predict. She is going to be extraordinary, she already is. And I have Nathan. Nathan, who showed up in a flannel shirt in a small-town diner and delivered the most significant information of my life, with the kind of steadiness that only comes from someone who has been through their own kind of loss and come out the other side with their character intact. Nathan, who listens to the whole thing before he speaks. Nathan, who brought burgundy wine to my kitchen table and helped me hang shelves badly and sat on a snowy porch and told me something true because he decided I deserved to hear it. Nathan, who asked me, "How are you?" when the world was asking what happens next. We are not a neat story. We are 2 people in the second half of their lives, both carrying significant histories, both figuring it out as we go, both choosing each other daily in the ordinary, unglamorous, deeply real way that actual love works. Not as a grand declaration, but as a series of small, consistent, deliberate decisions. I will take that over the grand declaration every single time. Here is what I want to say to whoever in this forum is reading this and recognizing something. If someone has spent years making you feel like you are less than what you are, smaller, dimmer, more easily dismissed, less deserving of the space you occupy, I want you to hear me on this. They were wrong. Not philosophically wrong, not theoretically wrong. Practically, demonstrably, documentably wrong. And the proof of their wrongness does not always arrive on a schedule. Sometimes it takes 40 years. Sometimes it takes a rusty key in a brown envelope and 4.5 hours on a highway in a town you've never heard of. But it comes. And when it comes, you don't have to perform triumph. You don't have to make a speech. You don't have to make sure they see you winning. You just have to keep going. Keep being yourself, fully and without apology, in your own house, in your own town, on your own terms. The rest takes care of itself. I promise you, I have the paperwork to prove it. To everyone in this community who read the whole thing, thank you. This took me several evenings to write and considerably longer than that to live, and putting it here meant something to me that I won't try to oversell. Robert, if there's any version of anything where you can read this, you chose me out loud in the end. I heard you. I'm okay, better than okay.